What I want to do tonight is go ahead and give a fuller answer to the question that was asked on Wednesday night. There was a question asked on Wednesday night for the Devo period, and I only had a couple of minutes to address it, and I would like to address it in a more fuller way tonight. It is a good question, and it is a matter of biblical interpretation of Matthew chapter 24. The question was, is this virus and this pandemic, should it be viewed as a sign of the end times? Should what's going on today be viewed as a sign of the end times? Now, that question is clearly coming from some of the things that we read from Matthew 24, for instance, verses 3 through 8. Now, let's look at this context, and we'll see perhaps the background of this question. And I'm sure it's a question that a lot of people are asking. So Matthew 24, verses 3 and following says, "Now as he," that's Jesus, "as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?'" Translation might say the end of the age. So what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And Jesus answered them, and he said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, because many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Because nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places, and all these are the beginning of sorrows." Now, that idea of the famines and the pestilences and the earthquakes, I think, is probably the background of some of the thinking that is pretty prevalent in our culture today about signs of the end of time. And so they believe Jesus here is actually answering the question about the coming of Jesus and the end of the world by telling us here that there will be these signs. Now, again, this is going to have to be settled by a contextual study of Matthew 24. This is paralleled in Mark 13 and Luke 21. So there are three different passages that give a pretty detailed description of this particular part of the context. But Matthew 24 is as full as any, and so we're going to confine our study for the most part here in Matthew 24 and get the overall context in order to understand better what Jesus is describing here. And in order to get that context, let's back up to the beginning of chapter 24, and we'll see here that says Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And it says that in the chapter before this, that he was talking there to the people of Jerusalem, and this was the final time that he was going to be teaching in the temple area. In fact, in the very last verse of chapter 23, he says, "You will see me no more until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" In the verse before that, he said, "Your house is left unto you desolated." So he's talking there about the temple and about the fact that he was no longer going to be in that temple any longer until he comes. And so that is the immediate context of these statements. It says in chapter 24 and verse 1 that whenever he went out of the temple, and then his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple, Jesus said to them, he made this prediction, "Do you see all these things?" What things? Well, the temple. This whole Temple Mount and this whole area of Jerusalem. "Do you not see all these things?" He says, "Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left there upon another until, or rather that shall not be thrown down." So here he's predicting the demolition, the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem on this occasion. So that's what's in the minds of the disciples when it says in verse 3, he went to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came privately and they asked him, when? When will these things be? They are asking him about when the destruction of the temple was going to take place that Jesus just predicted. The Mount of Olives was across the Valley Kidron on the other side, or on the side of Jerusalem there. And so they were able, up on the side of that mountain, Mount of Olives, to see an overview of the city of Jerusalem and the temple area setting there. And so Jesus has this backdrop in front of him as he explains the signs of the coming of Jesus and of the end of the age, it says. Now, in the disciples' question there, the sign of his coming and the end of the age, they had conflated. They had brought two questions together into one question, because in their minds, if God was going to destroy the temple of Jerusalem, that seemed to them to mean the end of the world. Because after all, that's God's house. That's God's dwelling place here on earth. And so if he's coming to destroy that, surely that means the end of the world, the whole end of time. And so their question is asked with a conflation of Jesus destroying the temple and the end of the world at the same time. So Jesus begins to answer their question, but he will answer their question in a twofold way. He will answer first the question about the signs concerning his coming to destroy the temple, and then he will address the second question, which is the end of time, the end of the world. And we will see that here in this chapter, Matthew 24, as we get into this particular context. Now, it's important to remember, historically, we know already that the destruction of the temple took place about 40 years after Jesus made this prediction. The Roman army, under the guidance of General Titus, marched on the city of Jerusalem starting in about 68, 69, and by AD 70, they had overrun the temple, the city. They had burned everything and killed all of the inhabitants for the most part. It was just total destruction. And so it was a terrible judgment on the nation of Israel for their rejection of Jesus Christ. And that's what he's predicting here. Now, he's going to start giving them a way to know when that's going to take place, because there will be signs that serve as warnings, as portents of what is about to take place. And so that's what he begins to explain. And we'll notice this. Let's read verses 4 through 8 as we just did, or I guess we already read that. But he says in verse 6, for instance, you will hear of wars, rumors of wars. Don't be troubled. All these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So here, verses 4 really through 14, he's saying it's not yet, but these signs will come to pass. And then we're approaching the time that I will return in that judgment on the temple. That's why he says the end is not yet in the end of verse 6. Notice verse 8, he says, all these, including those famines and pestilences and earthquakes of the verse before, all these are merely the beginning of sorrows. He goes on to say, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. You shall be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Many will be offended. They will betray one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. He who endures to the end shall be saved. So he's picturing this great time of difficulty, clearly in this context for the Jewish people, these Jewish religionists that was worshiping at the temple, and all of the Roman occupation and difficulties that would come from them upon the Jewish people. But he says in verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. So he's saying through all those verses, these are signs, but these are not signs of the very end. They're signs of the beginning of the end. Now he narrows his predictions, not now to the wars all over the world and the famines that's going on throughout the Roman Empire, but now he narrows his focus to Jerusalem itself, verses 15 through 28. And what he's going to be saying here is, it's not the beginning now. This is what happens right before the end. And he warns them, when you see these things take place, it's time to flee the city. Get out of the city and make for the hills, because you know that the Roman armies are about to destroy the temple. Verse 15, he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Let those who are in Judea, you see, we're talking about those in Judea, let them flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Him who is in the field, let him not go back and get his clothes. And woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. See, he's giving instructions about fleeing when these signs come to pass, showing the very end is near. And it's for a geographical place. If this was a prediction of the very end of the world, it wouldn't matter if you flee to the mountains. It wouldn't matter what day of the week, whether or not the gates of the city would be shut. It wouldn't matter. This is all geographical, and it's centered in Judea. He explains, however, in verse 21, there is going to be great, great trouble, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. The Jews suffered immensely under this because of their rejection of Jesus and God bringing an end to the Jewish economy because of their rejection of Christianity. Verse 22, he says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake. So that is for those Jewish people who did become Christians, those who were God's elect. Jesus here is warning them, giving them signs so that they can get out of the city and flee and be saved from the wrath of God that is coming upon the city. In verse 23, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ there he is, do not believe it, because false Christs, false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive even the elect if possible. But look, I have told you beforehand. And so if they say to you, he's in the desert, don't go out there. If they say he's in the inner rooms, don't believe them. So he's saying here that there's going to be all kinds of pandemonium. There's going to be all kinds of pretenders trying to gather their armies for battle against the Romans. And he's saying, don't try to resist it. There's no reason, because I am not coming to battle the Romans. I'm coming to destroy the city. And you need to flee and get out of the city, remove yourself from the apostate nation so that I can come in my judgment and justice, and you will be spared. Verse 27, further signs. As lightning comes from east and flashes to the west, this is also going to be like the coming of the Son of Man, because wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So this is how signs function, right? They function as portents, as warnings, and if you take these warnings, you will be saved because you'll be able to flee before it's impossible to get out of there. Now, verses 29 through 33. So we've seen, of course, in the earlier paragraph that we read, he was saying these are only the beginning. Verses 15 through 28, he's saying this is right before the end. And now 29 through 33, he's saying then this is the end. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, the language that Jesus uses here is probably the source of much confusion among many Bible interpreters, and understandably so, because the language that he uses in these verses sounds so much like the very end of the world, where the entire globe is being judged, and the outer space and the heavenly bodies are all being affected by this kind of judgment. We're going to come back in a moment to address that overlap between Jerusalem and the end of the world in the words that Jesus uses here, but we got to read on in order to have a better understanding of how to interpret that. So in verse 32 now, he says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that the summer is near. And so you also know when you see all these things that it is near, it's even at the doors. And now here's the key, verse 34. Highlight this with all of the highlighters that you got, because this is key. Assuredly, I say to you, This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. A generation was approximately 40 years. And he's saying that the generation that he was speaking to at that time would not pass away until everything he's just predicted takes place. Now that's, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind, because that helps us to interpret what's being said in verses 29 through 33 with the seemingly end of the world kind of terminology. What we have there is apocalyptic imagery that denotes total upheaval, an overturning of entire world system, so to speak. And it's found in many places in the Old Testament prophets. The idea of constellations being moved and shaken, stars falling, and on all of this cosmic disturbance and upheaval. Isaiah chapter 13, verses 10 and following. Isaiah chapter 34, verses 4 and 5. Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 7 and 8. All of these Old Testament prophets used very similar, if not identical, terminology to refer to the destruction of other nations, of the various nations of the ancient world. And we know, of course, that historically that unfolded even as it was predicted, and those nations were destroyed, but the world didn't come to an end. But it's just a way of relating the devastation and the significance of the destruction that's foretold. And so that's what Jesus is doing here. He's borrowing that terminology. Now, I will make the point in just a moment that that terminology even exists because it is an accurate description of what will literally take place at the end of the world. But it's borrowed by prophets in the Old Testament, and it's borrowed by Jesus right here to refer to temporal judgments, to historical judgments on nations, and here on the nation of Israel, in order to emphasize the significance of what's going on. And so it's important for us to see that. And the key to this interpretation is what Jesus says in verse 34, that he makes it clear that the generation that he's preaching to will still be around when all the things that he just predicted takes place. So I think that's very important. Now this, as I said, is also reiterated in Mark 13 and Luke 21. Luke 21 is even more specific when it talks about the immediate signs before the end. In Luke 21, verse 20, Jesus here, Luke records him explicitly saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. And then he uses more terminology from what we just read in Matthew 24. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country go back in order to get anything, and so forth. So clearly, everything we've been talking about in the context and in the text of Matthew 24 so far is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem in the lifetime of those hearing Jesus make these kinds of predictions. So that's key, I believe, to understanding that when Jesus talks about signs, which would include in your King James Version and New King James Version, pestilences of chapter 24 and verse 7, then he's not talking about the end of the world that's still future to us. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. That there would be remote signs in all the nations, wars, rumors of wars. All nations would be involved in this, in the persecution of Christianity, of his followers, and the persecution of the Jewish people. And then it narrows down to Judea. And then he says, then the end comes when the Son of Man returns in judgment on his nation that rejected him. But that brings us, of course, now to the transition. We transition over now where Jesus begins in a very clear way, I think, to explain the second question. When will be the end of the world? Will there be any signs with regard to the end of the world? Verse 35, Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven. My Father is the only one that knows. Or you see what Jesus is doing there? He's now transitioned to the passing away of the heavens and the earth. Verse 35. when Jesus comes at the end of time to bring an end to this world system, to this world economy. And he says, of that day and hour, nobody knows. Now, you have to see the big contrast in this kind of terminology. If you'll notice, he was saying, before this, he was saying, you will know. You will know. For instance, in verse 32, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that the summer is near. So you know also when you see all these things that the end is near, even at the doors. But then he changes terminology and says, but no one knows of the end of the world, not even the angels of heaven, but the Father only. And then he begins to give a few illustrations to prove his point and to show the similarity of how it's going to be at the end when no one knows the exact time. No one is sure when Jesus is going to return in final judgment. In verse 37, he likens it to the days of Noah. As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days of Noah before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. He gives some more illustrations, but he uses the concept of a thief in the night. Verse 42, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. If the master of the house had known, that's verse 43, what hour the thief would come, then he would have watched, not allowed his house to be broken into. But you, since you don't know, you must be ready at all times, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. The idea is he's coming at an hour that you don't know. And so the main lesson from then on through the next chapter and a half is dealing with the importance of God's people being ready at all times. Be busy serving Jesus Christ. Be busy about the matter of the gospel and the Great Commission and service toward one another and our fellow man at all times, so that you're prepared when Jesus comes unexpectedly. And so you're seeing these kinds of lessons throughout these next few parables. For instance, verse 45 says, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, now listen to this, my master is delayed in his coming, and so he begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards. Well, the master of that servant is going to come at a day when he's not looking for him, in an hour that he does not know. And he will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So here's a new element that's introduced, this idea of delay, There will be no delay whenever the signs come to pass, as he says in chapter 24 and verse 29, immediately after these things, then Jesus is coming. But here it seems that you have a whole different outlook. It seems as if God is slow, seems as if God is delayed. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 9 says, God is not slow concerning his promise, but instead he's patient, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so this is what Jesus is mentioning. So he mentions delay in chapter 24, verse 48. He mentions delay in chapter 25 and verse 5 in the bridegroom who is delayed coming to get his bride. So when it comes to the end of the world, it's going to seem as if God is very slow or very delayed in his return. And that's an entirely different attitude and a concept from the immediacy that's seen in the destruction of the temple. And so I would simply say that we do not have to look for signs today. There's no reason to look for signs, because Jesus here says there will be no signs of the second coming at the end of the world, but that the counsel of the Bible is to always be ready. Paul himself used this same kind of terminology in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 when he talked about the second coming of Jesus in judgment. It's actually 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Did I say 2 Thessalonians? 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he says, "But concerning the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves know perfectly well that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when people around are saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape." And so it's much like the days of Noah, as Jesus had said. They're eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, and they don't know until the day that the flood comes and takes them all away. That's the kind of thing Paul is picturing. But for Christians who are always laboring in the kingdom, always being faithful to God, we will not be caught unawares. That's verse 4. "But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You're sons of light, sons of the day. We're not of the night nor of darkness, and so do not sleep," he says, "as others do, but let us watch and be sober. Those who sleep, sleep at night. Those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. Because God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." So that's the same lesson and the same message that we're getting from Jesus in these chapters in Matthew 24 and 25. To be ready always. Now, I would like to conclude this Bible study by making maybe a strange statement. I believe the virus and the pandemic is a sign. It is a sign of a few things. First of all, it's a sign that life is fragile and temporary, and that we do not know what will happen tomorrow. We're not guaranteed another day. The virus is a sign that we are not ultimately in control. There are forces and dangers in this world that can overtake us and that we can do nothing about it. The virus is a sign that we will indeed have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of the things that we have done, because our life is temporary, and after death is the judgment. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 27 and 28. But for the Christian, I believe that the virus is a sign that should remind us that there is indeed one who sits on the throne. There is someone who is greater than any threat that this world may offer, and that we serve him, and that we can trust him, and that we worship him, and that we glorify him, and that we rejoice in him, even in times of difficulty. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And let patience have its perfect work, that you may be complete, lacking nothing. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. We're going to be led in a song and a final prayer by Jeremy, and then we're going to end the live stream.